Hello and welcome to the webinar on extreme weather, challenges and opportunities for organic farming systems in the Midwest region by Joel Gruver of Western Illinois University. I'm your host, Alice Formiga from the eOrganic Community of Practice at eExtension. You can find all eOrganic articles, videos, and our many upcoming and recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our website at the link on your screen. So today, I'm very happy to welcome Joel Gruver as our speaker. Joel is an associate professor of soil science and sustainable agriculture, and he's also the director of the organic research program at Western Illinois University. So thank you for joining us today, Joel, and I'm going to hand over the screen control to you right now.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, whatever time it is where you are. I am going to share a number of ideas with you today. Some will be very personal, related to my farming experiences, and some will be more a synthesis of research and other ideas I've heard from other people. So we had a very, very wet June and July in Illinois. So wet that it was causing great frustration to the industry, not just the organic farmers, but all farmers in the Midwest region. And I was invited to share an editorial titled, "What Are Your Soggy Fields Telling You?" And I got some interesting response to this editorial. One of the reasons why some people responded, I think, with frustration is because when faced with extreme weather, it's easy to feel helpless and to miss opportunities for learning. It's easy to think, really, there's only one problem, and that's that it's too wet, or that I haven't put enough tile into my fields, rather than thinking about the learning opportunities. I just want to share a quote here. This is from a policymaker, but I think this is relevant. "Unfortunately, we tend to focus on drought or other types of extreme weather when it is upon us. We're then forced to react, to respond to immediate needs, to provide what are often more costly remedies, and to attempt to balance competing interests in a charged atmosphere. Even if we're not involved with policy, even if we're just making our own decisions on our own farm, if we are just reacting to extreme circumstances, whether they be weather or other types of circumstances, we're not likely to make the best decisions." So in my editorial, I stated, "We all have observed spatial variation in crop growth this season and during other seasons with extreme weather, both excessive rain and drought. Some of this variation is related to soil type and topography, but management also plays a role. For example, the striping of fields related to tile lines or uneven distribution of fertilizer and crop residue. This variability can be very disheartening, but it is also informative. I challenge you to look closely at the variation in your fields this year and identify opportunities for improved soil management and associated weatherproofing of your farm." And I got some very interesting feedback. Some people really took my challenge seriously, and they really thought about not just how wet it was or how much more tile they needed to install, but rather what they could learn about residue management, what they could learn about the uniformity of inputs they were applying or the lack of uniformity. And so it was an interesting dialogue. As I started thinking about this presentation, I realized that I started preparing for this webinar over 20 years ago. I don't know how many of you have read this interesting book, Future Harvest, Pesticide-Free Farming by Jim Bender, but I first picked it up in 1995. And I had just joined the internet. I had just gotten onto a listserv called SandNet. Some of you may be subscribers. And this was one of my first posts. Not my first, but one of the first ones. I said, "I am currently reading Future Harvest by Jim Bender. In his chapter comparing conventional and sustainable systems, he states that the basic strategy for conventional agriculture is to maximize the maximums, while the strategy of sustainable agriculture is to maximize the minimums." And when I read that, it just stopped me in my tracks. I thought, this is such a simple differentiation, but it actually has a lot of power to it. And so I was asking the readers of SandNet, what do you think? Does this make sense to you? And, did Jim Bender come up with his phraseology, or did somebody else? What it's basically saying is that there are contrasting strategies, and this isn't necessarily conventional versus organic, but there are contrasting strategies in terms of how people approach their management. Some people use high inputs to produce the best possible yields in years with excellent growing conditions. Basically, they are maximizing the maximums. Other people build farming systems that are less vulnerable during seasons with very challenging conditions. They may not swing for the fences, but they are maximizing the minimums. Basically, they're raising up the low yields so that they don't, fall apart, so that they don't crash when conditions are very challenging. And as I thought about that quote from Jim Bender, then I also thought about another thing that I had read that's related. This was even a few years earlier, back in the 80s. Bob Rodale said something along these lines, and this is not a direct quote, but this is as close as I can remember it. Most farmers are using methods which do not allow production flexibility. American agriculture of the conventional type works only when the throttle governing energy and input flows is pulled all the way out. Farmers lack the option of switching, either permanently or temporarily, to alternate systems that perform well when conventional production is not profitable. So what I'm getting at here is there are different strategies. Some strategies are more flexible. Some strategies lock you into a system that can perform extremely well some of the time, but can also crash when you have extreme weather or other challenges. And so as I thought about what I wanted to talk about today, I thought about agroecological dimensions and also sociological dimensions, because ultimately it's not just the science of agriculture, it's the decisions that are made by people. And there's a context, an operating context, there's knowledge, there's individual capability that is related to the people involved. But then we also might have a particular crop that is more sensitive, but we only have exposure if we plant that crop or if we plant it at certain times. So all of these things put together create potential impact that is operating in the context of an individual's adaptive capacity, and that creates vulnerability, or the opposite of vulnerability, which is resilience. This is an excellent opinion piece. This was just published this year, Enhancing Agroecosystem Performance and Resilience Through Increased Diversification of Landscapes and Cropping Systems, Matt Liebman and Lisa Schulte at Iowa State. And they define resilience, and then they explain some of their research, basically how they've looked at adding biodiversity to cropping systems and how that's impacted resilience. They define resilience as ability to resist and recover from various forms of stress, including herbivorous pests, diseases, droughts, and floods, basically extreme weather. And that is, I think, a very, very valuable definition, but it, of course, is not including the human, the sociological dimension, which is also a key part of resilience. To look more broadly at resilience, I highly recommend this book by a friend of mine, Laura Lennick. Let's just take a look at this very brief review of the book. This is a timely and important contribution, bringing the science and thinking behind resilience to address the practical problems facing agriculture under global change. A focus on production and efficiency alone reduces capacity to deal with the rising frequency of unexpected secondary effects and novel situations. Laura Lennick's book brings the two needs together in a readable and helpful way. I really like that comparison. Production and efficiency, certainly an important part of agriculture, but we can become so focused that we are swinging for the fences and we're losing our capacity to reduce our vulnerability. Another great resource is the sustainablecorn.org website, and there are lots of different collaborators in this, lots of valuable resources. They had a conference last year that I did not attend, but I've looked at some of the materials. Lots of good thinking on resilience. Just quickly, I want to show you some of the tools that are available through this website. And these are tools that may be useful to you, may not, but I think it's valuable to think about how we can quantify weather, how we can think about how extreme weather is in different circumstances, how we can go forward and backward in time, look at the present, but also go back and see just how unusual a weather event might be. This particular decision support tool, Corn Growing Degree Day model, it's an innovative tool that integrates corn development stages with weather and climate data for location-specific decision support. It's a really valuable tool. Growing degree days, of course, are the amount of temperature that you've had above a certain base. And so with corn, we normally think of the base as 50 and we think of the cap as 86. And so we can think about how temperature accumulates between those, between that base and cap. And we can look at how different seasons compare. And of course, 2012, the year of the extreme drought in the Midwest and broader than the Midwest, it was very hot. And so that's the top line there. We had a lot more growing degree days. But then 2014 was much cooler, particularly in the fall. When we were harvesting in 2014, just, basically just over a year ago, it was about 15 degrees for the high temperature during the day. So very different seasons. It's interesting to think about not just growing degree days, but stress degree days. These are the days when you can set a particular base, but in this case, the base is 90 degrees. So this is how much temperature is accumulating above 90. And we can see that we had quite a spike in 2012, and actually 13, 14, and 15, we had very few days where it got above 90 degrees. It's kind of interesting to compare 2012, which seems so extreme, to two back-to-back seasons in the 80s. 87 and 88 actually had many more stress degree days. It was over 90 degrees, significantly more, and in both cases we see that spike in July. So those were some very tough times. Another thing we can look at is 2015. We had this extremely wet period, 300 to 500% of normal precipitation during June and July. And that's what you can see as the turquoise peak in the middle. And you can see just how unusual that is. The grayer area is what would be considered, a normal range of precipitation. And having that extreme precipitation in the middle of the summer is very, very unusual. What that precipitation means on a practical level is that you are very limited in your field work. And so another tool that you can get through the Sustainable Corn website is this probable fieldwork days model created by the University of Missouri. And very practical, very useful for thinking about what size should your implements be so that you can maximize the likelihood that you will get your field work done during different seasons. Another trend that's quite a distinct trend, it's quite evident when you look at the numbers, but it's not exactly clear what the impact is just how warm it has been in most of our winters over the last 40 years. Obviously, we've had some cold winters, but the overall trend is that we are distinctly warmer, and especially in the mid to upper Midwest region, we are warmer in the winter, and that's impacting winter survival of pests, winter survival of cover crops. So both positive and negatives can come with that warmer winter trend. But probably the most distinct, the clearest trend of all, if we look at weather data, is the increasing frequency and intensity of weather downpours, heavy downpours. And when we take a look, for example, a 3-inch or more rainfall event used to be quite rare. Now we have, in the 2000 to 2010, 2001 to 2010 period, we have 52% more of those events than we had prior to this time frame that's being looked at. So we have distinct increases in these multi-inch rainfall events, and of course those are the ones that cause the most erosion, that cause the most negative effects on our crops. So let me provide the specific context for where I will be coming from when I talk about my personal experiences. The research farm that I manage is in South West Warren County, Illinois. It's about 15 miles northwest of Macomb, Illinois. We have been cash renting, the university has been cash renting this land from a private landowner since 1989. So it is not owned by the university. We, most of the time, have an individual year-to-year rent that we renegotiate each year. And we're paying competitive rents with the neighbors in that community. We have some excellent soils. These are deep prairie soils, mollisols. The A horizon is about 24 inches or deeper. Middle of the farm, the Muscatoon soil is our best soil. It's a little bit higher in elevation and a little bit better drained. But as you can see on the right in that soil profile image, you can see some of the modeling, the redoxymorphic features. These are soils that have a fluctuating water table that comes near the surface every year. They also have a relatively high clay content. The sable is a silty clay loam, whereas the Muscatoon is a silt loam. But in the B horizon, they have about 30% high activity clay. And so these are clays that shrink and swell dramatically. And so we end up with large cracks during a very dry period like the summer of 2012. This is a LiDAR elevation model. So it was flown over by a plane, and using a LiDAR system, they measured the elevation. And what you can see is that green swath across the middle of the farm. And the farm is identified by the dotted black line. That green swath through the middle, going from the southwest up to the northeast, that's a higher elevation. And then you can see that we also have lower elevation on either sides of that green band. The lower elevation is not much lower. It's only a few feet lower, but those are the areas where when we have extreme wetness, we have the most flooding. And so we have ponding that during a season like this season occurs for extended periods. We will have multiple weeks where we have large areas, multiple acres that are underwater. This is because we have significant surface drainage problems. We potentially can do enough earthwork to allow the water to flow more. We need to move soil out of our ditches, but we need to do it in a way that it is in compliance with the drainage law in Illinois. We also potentially could put in drainage tile, but of course that's difficult when we don't have a good outlet, and the landowners have been great to work with, but they are not interested in the capital investment associated with tile. So when we have dry seasons, the whole farm performs very well. When we have wet seasons, like 2015, we have serious challenges. Our basic approach is a 3 to 4 year crop rotation. We're growing the traditional crops grown in Illinois, but in addition to corn and soybeans, we essentially always grow a small grain. Recently, we've grown more oats, but we've also grown wheat. We've also grown barley. We've also grown rye. In between the small grain and the corn, normally we would have either red clover, that's our traditional approach, or after the small grain, so that red clover would be frost seeded. But sometimes we would plant radishes or mixtures of summer cover crops following the small grain harvest. Between corn and soybeans, typically we would plant a small grain cover crop like cereal rye. And then we have been working on extending the rotation, sticking in sunflowers, sometimes sticking in pumpkins. Pumpkins are our latest innovation, or latest extension of our rotation. And basically we would stick them in following soybeans. Both the sunflowers and pumpkins would follow the soybeans, and then they would be followed by the small grain. We're doing large-scale mechanized agriculture. Our plots are typically 10 to 40 feet wide, and we use full-scale farming equipment most of the time. And so we don't own very much of that equipment, so we rent it from our neighbors. And it's really a great working relationship. We pay our neighbors, we clean their equipment, and we also benefit from their knowledge. These are very experienced, successful farmers that we work with. Our closest collaborator has been working with us to add some precision agriculture practices. And so we've been using his equipment with RTK guidance more and more on the farm. And so this, the idea here is that we have satellite guidance that is plumbed into the steering of the equipment, and we are able to create a straight line that we can repeat within 1-inch accuracy, even coming back a year later. We have lots of people come out to the farm. 2015 was a great year in terms of lots of visitors. You can see a picture of lots of little people that came out to the farm. This was a group of first and second graders, but we also had researchers. We also had farmers. We also had politicians. It was a big year in terms of visitors, but we typically have quite a few hundred visitors come to the farm. We've been expanding our outreach to farmers that are transitioning to organic. This is the gentleman in the middle of the picture. He came out to the farm dozens of times. Probably at least half of the time we weren't present. We told him, if you want to see what's happening, you don't need us to be there to tell you what's happening. Just come out and take a look. And so this is a farmer that's taking organic transition very seriously, and he wants to make sure he addresses his vulnerabilities, that he's aware of problems that can occur, and he's prepared to deal with them. And so he came out and visited the farm very regularly. But there's a strong interest in the Midwest region, landowners as well as farmers, about organic transition. And so we've been, Andy Clayton, my technician who's standing next to the farmer, he and I have been handling lots of questions. It's been exciting how much interest there is in organic transition. So let me tell you just a little bit, just a quick overview about our recent experiences with extreme weather. We've had a lot of extreme weather. I've been working on this project for 8 years, started in 2007, and most seasons have had some extreme weather. These ones that I've identified here are probably the most extreme cases, and probably in terms of drought, 2012 was the most extreme. We only had less than 4 inches of rain during the growing season. And then in 2015, the extreme wetness in June and July was even more extreme than 2010, which was a record-breaking year. So what has been the impact of this extreme weather? There have been lots of impacts. Some of these impacts have been agroecological, some of them have been sociological. And I won't read through all of these, but the basic idea is that because we have had compromised crop performance, we've lost yield and we've had reduced revenue. And just like a purely commercial farming operation, this has significant impacts on the people that run the farm, because the majority of our funding most years is actually from the sales of our crops. And so when we don't have crop revenue, we struggle to pay our rent. We don't have crop revenue, we don't buy new equipment, we don't use as many inputs. So we are in a situation that's not the same as a commercial farm, but there are a lot of parallels. Hopefully, we are responding with adaptive management. We're being faced with challenges, faced with necessity, and hopefully that's driving us to innovate. And I think we are, but at the same time, it's created stress. It's created basically a level of frustration that makes it hard to innovate sometimes. There's certainly been more manual labor during these seasons where we've had the most extreme weather. Sometimes we've had more effective weed control. Drought can provide more effective weed control, but sometimes we've had less effective weed control. Let's just think about adaptive management briefly. This individual who you can see there looking at that strip till unit, he's thinking about how can I adapt that to a different farming system. He's thinking about how can I work with that particular tool, but maybe adjust it. He's looking for the different parts of that tool that are adjustable. He's looking for how residue might flow through that tool. that individual happens to be a very, very deep thinker about mechanical weed control. And he's somebody that when we first heard him speak, it actually seemed too good to be true. Some of the claims he was making about the level of precision he was achieving were so different than what we were achieving that it seemed too good to be true. But we decided we would hire him. Back in 2012, we hired him to come do some consulting for us and help us to improve our mechanical weed control. And so here he is working with a cultivator that he rented to us. We first thought, well, we'll just have this guy come help us use our cultivator. We had a Buffalo high residue cultivator with one single wide sweep in the middle, and he quickly said, your cultivator is not sufficiently adjustable. You cannot do, no matter how well you set your cultivator, you cannot do what I will show you how to do with a different type of cultivator. And so here you could see him making some adjustments. This is a 6-row cultivator. He indicated very early on that he felt that there were hundreds, literally hundreds of different adjustments that could be made. And, at first I kind of doubted that since we weren't making anywhere close to that number of adjustments before with our previous cultivator. But pretty quickly, after watching him adjust and adjust and adjust, I realized this was a different type of animal. This cultivator really could be adjusted to do a much better job. And so here you can see the basic idea. It's a IH-153 old cultivator, but it has been modified. So it's been extended. So you can see that the sweeps or the shovels are farther apart than they would be on the historical model. We have 5 sweeps between each row. You can see the shields are quite narrow. They don't have to be set that narrow, but we do run them very narrow most of the time. You can see the sweeps or shovels are going to have a lot of overlap, and that's important to make sure that we don't have any escapes and that we get really good fracturing of the soil. There are 2 half sweeps that are right outside the row, and then we have the 3 wide sweeps that are in back. And the half sweeps can be set very tight. The original cultivation that we did working with the consultant, we were cultivating with about a 7-inch gap. And we don't always cultivate that tight, but for the first cultivation, especially for soybeans, we cultivate quite tight, and it impacts your performance. Here you can see the newer cultivator. This is another modified IH-153 that we actually bought from the consultant, and this was the first season that we ran it. And you can see we're using a tractor without a cab. We don't always do that, but for the first cultivation, we have a wand that's allowing us to see that we're keeping right on the row, and we try to go quite quickly. Normally, in this picture, we probably were going at least 5 miles an hour. This just shows how tight the shields are set. That, may seem risky, and of course, if you get too far off the row, then of course the shields fill up with your corn plants, and you have problems. But the shields are actually part of your weed control system. They help to lay down any larger weeds so that they can more easily be buried. And so, these are all movable parts that you have to think about how to adjust them. You have to adapt what you're doing to the actual field conditions, the residue conditions, the soil moisture, and the weed pressure. And here's what we're trying to achieve. You can see that we have soil that has been peaked right around the crop row. We've had good fracturing of the soil. All the weeds now, are going to desiccate rapidly. But a critical part of making this work, of course, is to have a good stand of crop, and I'll talk more about that shortly. Here you can see cultivating some soybeans, fair amount of weeds out there, but we have the cultivator set right. After multiple rounds of adjustment, we have it set right, and it's doing an excellent job. Here you can see this is a few days after cultivation, but you can see the soybeans are an excellent stand, planted with a good planter, and we have soil that is not ridged. We don't throw a large ridge of soil around the row, but it's soil that has been flowed into the row from multiple sweeps so that it has buried the weeds in the row quite effectively. Establishing an excellent stand is the most critical thing you can do, and we own a 4-row buffalo planter. Even with improvements to the planting units, we're not able to achieve the stand that we would like, and so we have been using our neighbor's planter for the last couple of years, and the difference is dramatic. This 12-row air planter is able to do a much better job than our 4-row planter. Part of why it does a better job is because we often are working with the farmer, and so we're getting the benefit of 40 years of experience of how to set a planter. But we also have a planter that just simply has more options in terms of adjustment. It is able to do, when set right, it does a much better job than our old planter when set right. You can see this is a very, less than ideal seed bed that we're planting on strips that were made with a strip till unit, but this planter still was able to do a pretty good job. Some years the weather really cooperates. 2014 was one of those years, and we were able to have excellent weed control. Sometimes there was rain in the forecast, but it seemed like we would get things done always in a timely fashion right before the rain, and so the crop would benefit from the rain, but our field work was not compromised by the rain. And so you can see a nice stand of corn there, just cultivated one time, and the corn took off. At that stage, the corn is about to explode upward, and you can see just a few weeks later that same field. And so only one cultivation was needed for very effective weed control, and we had excellent yields. 2 different experiments were close to 180 bushel per acre average in that field. One adaptive management that we made that season, 2014, was we recognized that the cultivator only performs properly when it's going at the right speed. And so at the beginning of the field, the edge of the field, it's obviously not going at the right speed. And so we weren't getting the cultivation effectiveness that we wanted. And so we decided to till out a 10-foot swath along the edge of our cornfields and plant a mix of beneficial insect habitat. This was mostly leftover cover crop seed, but basically these were species like buckwheat, like mustard, like sunflowers that attracted beneficial insects to the nectar and pollen resources. And this is anecdotal, but we really did notice that the damage to the tips of our ears, the corn ears, seemed to be reduced. But that wasn't our principal goal. Our principal goal was to take a problem where we had poor weed control on the edge of the field and turn it into a beneficial situation. 2014, we had a field where we had drilled cereal rye in the fall of 2013 with the expectation that we would harvest it for seed. The winter of 2013-14 was very extreme, and partly because we were no-tilling into corn stalks, we did not get the stand of cereal rye that we wanted. And so we ended up deciding that we would drill in forage oat, and then we also frost-seeded red clover, and we turned what had been a problem into actually an excellent collaboration with a neighboring farmer, and they came over and they took off the forage oats and red clover as a high moisture haylage. And then the red clover grew back beautifully. And this was one of the nicest stands of red clover we've ever had on the farm, and we worked with our collaborating farmer to try some strip tillage in that red clover. Here you can see some beautiful strips that were just made in that red clover. Then we came back, and so the stripping was done in mid-August, and then this would be late August. We're coming back, a little little more than a week later with our old planter, and we are planting radishes, precision planting radishes on those strips. You can see the radishes starting to emerge. Nice rows, 30-inch rows of radishes, perfectly straight, planted with guidance. Actually, no, the strips were made with guidance, but the planting of the radishes was just following the strips. And here you can see a really nice situation. We actually had used a cultivator to cultivate out some of the red clover. We were looking at different options for controlling the red clover and promoting growth of the radish, with the goal that we would come back and plant right over top of those radish rows in spring 2015. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize here is that we are looking at how to use equipment in innovative ways. We're looking at how to seize opportunities, that are presented by weather, and working with our neighbors' equipment. And the guidance associated with it is creating even more opportunities that we didn't have before. March 2015 was a drier spring than some, and so it was an excellent spring for drilling small grains. And so we no-till drilled oats into both soybean stubble and corn stubble. And you can see that's actually not a no-till drill, but it did a very, very effective job of establishing oats into those soybean, into the soybean stubble. And of course we had guidance provided for us because we had the old soybean rows that we could follow that we would not have been able to follow if we had done any tillage. Right after drilling the oats, we came across with a application of turkey litter, and that was something that we debated. When should we put on that turkey litter? Should we try and till it in? This application worked well, except for the problem associated with weed promotion. Because we ended up with so much rain, that additional fertility really increased weed pressure, and so we had some no-till drilled oats that had very few weeds, but where we put on the turkey litter, we ended up with lots of weeds. Just another picture just showing you that nice stand of oats that were no-till drilled into soybean stubble, and then some cereal rye spring planted. We have been trying to make use of opportunities in the spring when the weather is conducive to do some spring planting of cover crops. These were planted ahead of pumpkins. We've also been working on no-till soybeans, and what we have found can work quite well is double drilling of soybeans into standing cereal rye, so no rolling. In this case, we did come back and did some follow-up rolling. Nice stand of beans established and beautiful stand of soybeans. Originally, we were comparing tillage versus no-till. We've gotten away from that. Now we're looking at how to fine-tune our organic no-till practices. And this is not a system that we've perfected. We're not going to do all no-till soybeans across the whole farm anytime soon, but we compared two different varieties of soybeans this year, and I think we found a new variety that will even outperform the variety that we have been using before. One thing that happens when you have spring planted cover crops is that you are pulling more moisture out of the soil, and that's something that was quite a problem in the spring of 2012. You can see very interesting contrast here. Soybeans, the four middle rows that you can see, were planted in one pass. Two tall rows, two short rows, the same pass, planter pass across the field. And the rows on the right, they had radish, spring planted radish preceding. And so I think the main issue was moisture depletion, but there probably also were, there may also have been some allelopathy going on. With the excessive rain this season, we decided we needed to top dress some nitrogen. There aren't that many options available in organics, but Chilean nitrate can work quite well, and so here we are putting about 10 extra pounds of nitrogen per acre on with a little spinner seeder. You know, this isn't something you would do on a large scale, but this is an example of responding to extreme weather we realized our pumpkins could benefit from some extra nitrogen. This article by Matt Liebman and others, I think, states very clearly the role that I would like Chilean nitrate and nitrogen concentrates to play on our research farm and basically in organic farming systems. He describes powerful tools with which to tune rather than drive agroecosystem performance, referring to the synthetic fertilizer inputs. And obviously in organics we're not using synthetic fertilizer inputs, but we do have some products like Chilean nitrate which perform in equivalent ways. We're not driving the system, we are tuning the system with those types of inputs. 2015 was extremely wet, and I've referred to that already. You can see greater than 2 feet of rain. It was amazing. We had wildlife move right back into our fields very quickly. We had extreme weed growth because basically we had about a month and a half where we didn't have any opportunity to move across the field. But before those soybeans were neglected for a month and a half, we did a blind cultivation, which I think was quite valuable because it allowed us to have in-row weed control that doesn't always happen. And when you don't have in-row weed control, that is when you lose the most yield to weeds. So when we came back and cultivated those soybeans, a one-day window of opportunity, we actually cleaned them up very well because we had a good stand of beans, we didn't have much weed pressure in the row, and so the cultivator could clean up the inter-row weeds. Tried the same thing with the pumpkins. We were using a home-built pumpkin cultivator, and we were not able to control the weeds nearly as effectively because we were not able to control them in the row. I just want to refer very quickly to a set of farmer comments that we collected in this document. These were farmers and also consultants, and one particular thing that I want to refer to here is the farmer comments on how they address weed control disasters. We had a weed control disaster in our pumpkins. We are still wrestling with whether we did the right thing. Farmers have different options, different practices, and it's really useful to think about what successful farmers are doing when they have weed control disasters. So I want to just quickly, I'm just about out of time, but I want to quickly refer to a few opportunities that I think present themselves in organic systems that are underutilized. At Iowa State, they're doing research on prairie strips. They're finding some dramatic benefits, much less runoff, much less soil export, much less nutrient loss. You can take a look here, just some dramatic benefits in terms of things that are positively occurring and things that are not occurring where they have the strips. They're only putting in 10% of the area to these strips and achieving dramatic benefits. And some of these strips now are going on to commercial farms, including 2 organic farms. I think we have a real opportunity to make our systems more resilient if we put these strips onto our organic farms. But more research is needed. That's why it's happening on commercial farms now. Another opportunity that we have in organic farming systems is related to this interesting research by Mark Ryan and others, showing that organic cropping systems can tolerate more weeds before you lose as much yield. And so that creates the opportunity for interseeding. The idea of interseeding is that you are planting a cover crop into an established crop, but before the crop canopy has closed. And so lots of different opportunities exist, but I think this is an underutilized opportunity in organic farming systems, particularly because, as Mark Ryan's research suggested, we are not likely to lose yield if we have an organic system that is more tolerant of that competition. We've had good success in conventional systems when the cover crops are planted after V4, and so I think it's particularly likely that it will have success in organic systems. Another thing that we have learned about cover crops is simply how different they are. Annual ryegrass is one that is very tolerant of shade and wet feet, whereas radishes are very intolerant of wet feet. Here you can see some radishes that have well, you can see the aftermath. The wider lines are showing superior radish growth over tile lines. Bottom line is we are really focusing on how to solve problems using cover crops in strategic ways. We're trying to fit them into conservation cropping systems as just one component, but they are a component that I think we have particularly good opportunities to manage in new ways at the WIU Organic Research Farm. And I guess just to conclude, ultimately the resilience of farming systems comes down to the soil. When you have extreme weather, like we had this season, you have great opportunities to observe differences in soil health. Sometimes you can observe that when the weather is actually occurring, and sometimes you can observe this using rainfall simulation without actually losing any crops or soil. Both opportunities present great times to observe differences in how soil has been impacted by management. All I'll say about the next two slides is simply that great research has been done in Canada showing how hydraulic properties of soil have been improved by cover crops. Excellent research in England has been done to show how soils with more organic matter are more resistant to structural damage. And so what this really comes down to, I think if we want to make best use of our soil resources in organic farming systems, we have to figure out how to minimize structural damage, which is challenging when we need to get across the field. So that's why we are working on controlled traffic systems at the Organic Research Farm. The very last thing I want to state is, obviously, we still have failures. We have farming systems that, despite our best designs to make them less vulnerable, we do have failures, and so crop insurance is a valuable resource. It is a challenge to look at the organic crop insurance data and just see how much higher the risk seems to be, at least in the data that's available right now. There are more indemnities being paid out to organic farmers than to adjacent conventional farms. And so that's a challenge. We need to figure out that riddle. Why is it that we should be having more resilient soils, but we have higher indemnities? And so I will just conclude by saying we all are part of this quest for climate-proof farms. Organic farming systems offer opportunities because of their soil improving practices, but they offer, or they also entail challenges because of the need to get across the field, at least with traditional organic farming practices. Certainly no-till creates opportunities to reduce that. But I'd like to enlist all of you to be part of this quest for climate-proof farms and look forward to some of your questions or comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joel. We're about to begin our question and answer session. Let's see. Okay, here is one. Wonderful presentation, even to a simple beginning organic gardener. Bravo. Keep up the research. How can we help spread the word of what you are doing?
Well, the easiest way to find out more about our program is to go to our website. We have a website that reports, many of our research results. We get so busy with the production activities that we haven't done the best job of putting up our reports. But I'd recommend taking a look at our website, and maybe this will be motivation for me to double down this winter and get more of our research results up. We have field days, we have twilight tours, I speak at organic farming conferences, and I dialogue with lots of farmers. I think ultimately, the adaptive management is going to require innovative, creative, thoughtful individuals, and that's probably the most exciting part of this, is interacting with all the successful organic farmers that like to solve problems. Extreme weather creates lots of problems, but innovative farmers, after they get through the frustration, they find ways to keep going. And we are inspired by lots of the farmers that we collaborate with.
Okay, well, the call for questions has paid off. They're coming in very quickly now. So let's try to address some of them. Where can we learn more about the customized cultivator?
I didn't mention the consultant's name. I would recommend that you just contact me, and I can share with you his contact information. He works with lots of different farmers, and I don't want him to get overwhelmed. I think that he is probably quite busy already working with the farmers and landowners that he's currently working with, but certainly anyone who contacted him, he'd probably get back to you. And we also have now been working with this cultivator since 2012, and so my technician and I are pretty well versed in how it differs from other cultivators. It's quite similar in many regards, but it's more adjustable. It allows a precision of soil flow that allows in-row weed control better than most cultivators.
Okay, let's see. What do you think the impact of 15-inch corn would be on weed control?
The number one strategy for weed control is to have a highly competitive, happy crop. And so if you have 15-inch rows and you have corn plants, assuming we're talking about corn here, that are growing well on 15-inch rows, meaning that you have adequate soil resources, enough water and nutrition to grow that population on that spacing, you will have a canopy that develops faster, and you'll have more competition against weeds. I think that's very desirable, but it may reduce your options for rescuing the crop. And so, let's say that you don't get the stand that you are hoping for, or you have more weed pressure than you expected. You will have fewer options in terms of rescuing that crop. 15-inch rows may be a good fit for organic no-till, but then you have to figure out how to manage that residue, most likely a living cover crop, and whether you can plant through that, and those challenges. But narrowing row spacing, I think, is a great strategy for increasing the crop competitiveness, but you need to make sure that you have the other factors, such as enough soil resources to grow a crop on that narrower spacing.
Okay. Have you found that cover crops help soil retain more water over time, or are you just seeing cover crops pulling moisture out of the soil?
That's a good question. We normally are dealing with excessive wetness rather than excessive dryness. And so normally the moisture removal by the cover crop is actually quite desirable. That said, I think you have several things to think about in terms of how cover crops impact moisture retention in the soil. If you have a rolling landscape where runoff is more likely, having the cover crop residue on the surface improves your infiltration, or can improve your infiltration dramatically, so that you have better infiltration later in the growing season rather than runoff. And that I think is really where you have the biggest differences in moisture availability later in the season. You are actually capturing water that otherwise would be running off. And so, the sponge effect in the soil is important. Having the additional organic matter makes your soil a better sponge, but having the better infiltration into the sponge is maybe the most important thing that having cover crop residue at the surface helps you with. Obviously, cover crops utilize moisture, and so we do need to be careful about how cover crops compete with our cash crops for moisture. And so I guess my suggestion would be not to put all your eggs in one basket. When we had that negative effect of the radishes on the following soybeans, I was very glad that I didn't have the whole farm planted to radishes ahead of soybeans.
Mm-hmm.
We had multiple strategies, and it was distinctly obvious that some of the strategies worked better during that drought season, and some of the strategies didn't work as well. And so I guess the challenge is to come up with multiple strategies and be nimble enough to adjust, to adapt as needed.
Okay. When you used a buffalo planter and cultivator, were you using ridge-till? And if so, can we conclude that ridge-till was not the best option for you? Maybe you could mention the pros and cons of each system when you tried it.
I don't have a lot of personal experience with ridge-till. They were using ridge-till at the research farm before I arrived, and they were on 36-inch rows, and I think it worked quite well much of the time. I've heard positive things about weed control during that time frame. The main reason they moved away was they were not able to get their crops harvested on 36-inch rows. The availability of combines on 36-inch rows decreased, and so they switched to 30-inch rows because of that lack of harvesting ability, custom harvesting ability. And then on the 30-inch rows, they decided not to proceed with ridge-till. There are farmers, successful farmers, doing ridge-till on 30-inch rows, and we've done a little bit of we've dabbled in that a little bit, but we haven't been able to have continuous ridge-till simply because the harvesting equipment is going to run, the combine will be running over some of our ridges and smashing our ridges. So you have to have equipment that's compatible. But if you have equipment that's compatible, 30-inch rows can work with ridge-till. There are farmers successfully doing it in Iowa, and I think there are a lot of very valuable attributes of ridge-till in terms of having your warmer, drier soil to plant into. If you do continuous ridge-till, you have far fewer weed seeds that are being maintained in the row, so you improve your in-row weed control, and that's very desirable. We are looking at planting radishes ahead of most of our corn now, and in some cases we are cultivating those radishes, so we're actually throwing a small ridge. So we're doing temporary ridge-till, but of course we've gotten away mostly from using our ridge-till planter. So we're trying to use the equipment that we have available and borrow some of the benefits of ridge-till. I guess one last thing I'll mention is that last season this past spring, we actually used our 4-row planter as a fertilizer delivery system. We had these ridges that had been previously made. We sliced off the top of the ridge, and we delivered a 2x2 band of fertilizer, but we were not planting seeds. Then we came back about a week later and used our neighbor's 12-row planter to plant along those ridges, where the weeds had been moved out of the ridge by the ridge-till planter and fertilizer had been delivered, but the seeds weren't delivered until the neighbor's planter was used.
Okay, we have a question about, is there any way to get a copy of the Excellence in Organic Weed Management Insights from the Field document? Is that available
Yes.
online?
It's not currently available online, but I'd be very happy to send you a copy, and would be interested in any editorial comments that any of you would have. So I don't believe that I included my email address in the slides, but you can easily look up my contact information if you do a search for Western Illinois University School of Agriculture. And please email me if you are interested in a copy of that document. And we are continuing to interview farmers. So if you're doing anything innovative, whether it be related to extreme weather or other innovative organic farming practices, we'd like to interview you.
Okay, let's see. Here's a question about how many of your local farmers have switched to organic?
Not very many. But I guess my goal is more broad than um, convincing the local farmers to convert to organic. My goal is to see more use of cover crops, to see more conservation practices on the land, to see basically adaptive management that considers the the types of things that we consider inorganic, but we consider them within a legal framework, the USDA organic framework. And I don't think you have to be within that framework to capture the benefits of some of the practices that we're using. And so you do need to be in that framework to capture the premium prices, and I think that has enticed some of the farmers that have been converting. But my larger goal, since we are in a farming community of lots of successful conventional farmers, is simply to see more green on their landscapes in the winter. Just to hear them talking about greater concern about water quality and soil health, and I feel like that's happening. But it is encouraging when I had a farmer recently ask me if I was interested in renting a piece of his land. And that was the highest compliment. This is a farmer that is right in our community, and he wanted to know if we were interested in expanding. And that, to me, suggests that he is pleased with what we're doing. And I think we've made progress over time, and the local farmers have seen that. And getting that offer, that was quite a high compliment.
Here's a comment also on that subject. Extreme weather and climate change will sadly have a significant effect on the willingness of conventional farmers to transition and for organic farmers to succeed. The larger conventional farms that don't need as high a return per acre will succeed. Do you agree with that or have any comments?
Well, I think the largest risk management tool that will keep conventional farms afloat during challenging times is crop insurance. And I think crop insurance has a valuable role to play, but we need to really work with the RMA, the Risk Management Agency, to have crop insurance promote reduced risk on the farm. So practices that are less risky. And we don't want to just have crop insurance kick in whenever you have a failure. We want to have crop insurance encourage the practices that reduce risk. And I think we have a challenge, a big challenge when you look at the indemnity records. To date, crop insurance has not suggested that organic farming is always less risky. And I think we need to look carefully at that data. I haven't had a chance to look very much, but the small amount that I've looked at it, I was a little discouraged. And I think we need to maybe stratify that data and find out whether there are messages about some types of organic practices being more risky and some being less risky. But I think that anytime that we have a government policy like the public support of crop insurance, we need to make sure that those policies are targeted at reducing risk on the farm rather than just compensating when there is loss. And I'm not sure that the current crop insurance is really encouraging farmers to reduce risk on the farm.
A related question, what are your best guesses about why the organic fields showed less success than the conventional in these extremes?
I don't think I have spent enough time looking at the data to provide a good response. I guess I would enlist you. I'd enlist everyone who is willing to look at that data to try and figure out what the stories are.
Mm-hmm.
And I firmly believe that well-managed organic farms can have less risk, but I think that there's wide variation in the effectiveness of organic farming as it is practiced today, and we need to learn from our failures. And I think the documentation available today suggests that crop insurance is paying out more to organic farmers. Not all organic farmers, and certainly there are geographic differences, and so we just need to go through that data with a fine-tooth comb and find out what the stories are, and then address whatever the concerns are.
Mm-hmm. Can you say a little more about the prairie strips you planted and what sort of results you saw?
We have not planted prairie strips.
Okay.
So let me be clear about that. That is a practice that's being promoted in Iowa. I think it's a very exciting opportunity for adding biodiversity to crop fields, both on organic farms and conventional farms. And I would recommend that you go to the Prairie Strips website on the Iowa State, the Prairie Strips page on the Iowa State website and learn more about it. It's an opportunity that really needs to be put to the test. I think the initial evidence is very positive, but the evidence from commercial farms is just starting to come in, and there are only a couple organic farms that are part of their cooperators. So I don't know that the WIU Organic Research Farm is the best location, because we are almost completely flat, and so I think the prairie strips particularly fit rolling landscapes as an erosion control strategy. But maybe some of the most poorly drained areas in our fields should just be dedicated to prairie vegetation rather than our current approach to having rectangular fields and attempting to crop the whole field.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from several different people asking about what practices might be useful for people who are farming or gardening on a much smaller scale than what you mentioned in your presentation.
That's a good question, and I think it's hard to imagine the specific context, but I guess I would say one thing to think about is how to capture water resources so that they can be applied to the field later. When I was growing up, my family captured water off of the roof of our house. It flowed through what we called the aqueduct into a 2,500-gallon tank, and then we would use that to water our kitchen garden during the summer. So that's one example of capturing the water that comes during an extreme rainfall period and then putting it to use later. Obviously, you can capture water in soil and have it held by the soil organic matter, but that there are limits to how much water can be held in a soil. Maybe the most important thing in terms of making more water available to crops is to simply manage your soil so that you have deeper rooting. Expanding the soil volume that is available for roots to grow into is the number one way, I would say, to improve water availability and nutrient availability to crops. And so the ways to achieve that might include raised beds, might include using deep-rooted cover crops that create biopores that your following crop's roots can grow down. But I guess this is a message for small-scale and large-scale agriculture. The number one way to provide more water and more nutrients to our crops is to expand the rooting volume. And cover crops can do that, and other practices can do that as well.
Okay. What resources do you rely on for climate prediction for an upcoming season?
That's a good question. I tend to stick with the National Weather Service website, and it has become so clear to me that anyone involved with agriculture just follows the weather. And now, I don't know I don't know how much people try to predict out multiple months. That's not something that I have really spent a lot of time thinking about. But anyone who's involved with agriculture on a day-to-day basis is checking the weather, thinking about the weather, the weather in the next few days, what the weather has just been, and how that impacts your activities. It's just such an intimate connection with weather that people who are not involved with agriculture, they are just so much more disconnected. And I've just observed, this is kind of a social commentary. I've observed these differences between the farm community and the non-farm community. The intimacy with which you are connected to the weather is one of the biggest differences. Whether you're an organic farmer or a conventional farmer, if you are involved with farming, you're intimately connected to the weather, and if you're not involved with farming, you pay much less attention.
Okay, here's just a quick question about what you meant by double drilling.
Oh, okay. We actually drilled the soybeans 2 times. We went across the field, and one pass, seeding at half our intended rate, and then because we were using guidance, we moved over and split the middle. So our drill, a John Deere 750, was drilling on 7.5-inch rows, and so we basically moved over about 4 inches and drilled again. And the purpose of the double drilling is twofold. One is to knock down the rye mechanically, basically let the drill units serve as our roller crimper, and then to also get a more uniform stand of soybeans so that we would basically end up with a full canopy more rapidly. And I'm not sure that the double drilling is the best approach. We've done it several times now, and I've been pretty pleased with it. And I think that another option would be to drill the first pass at a different angle, or maybe I should say drill the second pass at a different angle compared to the first pass, and then you'll get even more action in terms of cutting and crimping of the rye. In our relatively small rectangular fields, that hasn't been feasible, but the basic idea of double drilling is to let the drill be your roller crimper, and also to get a more rapid canopy development by putting your seeds more uniformly across the field.
Okay, let's see. This person is planting alfalfa for an organic transition. Do you have any advice?
Well, I think that alfalfa is very responsive to soil fertility, so soil testing is quite important before you go into alfalfa. So you want to make sure your soil is well limed, and that really should take place. The lime application should take place probably 6 months or more before you plant the alfalfa, and you want to lime your soil to at least a pH of 6.5, 7 might be even better. Potassium fertility is also quite important, so you want to make sure that you have adequate potassium levels. And a key thing to keep in mind with alfalfa or any forage is that you are maximizing nutrient removal from the soil when you are removing the whole plant, as you would with alfalfa. And so it's important to build up your fertility, if possible, before you plant the alfalfa. And so you want to start with soil tests to tell you where you're at, and then think about options for putting down, additional fertility before you plant the alfalfa. And then I think the other thing to keep in mind is using a nurse crop, such as oats, so that you can reduce the weed pressure in your alfalfa. And there's good literature about that. That's a pretty standard practice, using oats or, in some cases, other small grains when you drill the alfalfa to make sure that you have less opportunities for weeds to grow in the early stand of your alfalfa.
Okay. Do you have any advice or information or resources on how to restore old cultivators to make them functioning and to be able to adjust them? Many of them are old and rusty.
Yeah. Well, I don't have I don't have nearly as much personal experience as farmers that have been farming a lot longer than I have. I guess my recommendation would be that you really seriously consider replacing all the sweeps, all the shovels or the sweeps. One of the things that we found when we talked to farmers about their weed management practices, the farmers that are most successful at organic weed management, they replace the sweeps on their cultivators much more routinely than other farmers. In some cases, they replace the sweeps every season. Now that obviously depends on how large their farming operation is, but the attention to detail is something that is just really obvious when you talk to farmers that are successful at organic weed control. And part of that detail is replacing the ground engaging parts on their cultivators, on their planters, on really all of their tools that engage the soil. And so, I think talking to a local farmer about, the specifics of a specific design of a cultivator, would be valuable, but just recognize that on an old cultivator, probably all the ground engaging parts should be replaced.
Okay. Have you done any work, or do you know of anybody who works with agroforestry type crops such as nuts and fruits, and can your findings be applied to these crops?
That's an interesting question. I have a little bit of personal experience from when the farm that I grew up on in Maryland, we were doing some small scale agroforestry. I think that, the resources in the Midwest are out there. There is an agroforestry center associated with the University of Missouri. There are several agroforestry research farms up in Minnesota. And I guess I would say that agroforestry it's an example of a practice like cover cropping that can fit into a conservation cropping system. The overall goal being keep the land greener more of the year. And so fitting in more perennials or more combinations of summer and winter annuals is really kind of a larger concept that I regularly recommend, and agroforestry fits into that because it's a way to add perennials to the landscape. And specifically how to address extreme weather. I think perennials, you need to have them well sited. So you need to put them in the right parts of the landscape so that they're least likely to be damaged by the extreme weather events. So you don't want them, if they're sensitive to spring freezes, you need to site them so that the air will move through the planting rather than settle right there. But those are the types of things that I'm sure you could find out if you talk to people at one of the agroforestry centers in the Midwest.
Okay, thanks. I think this is our last question here because we're running out of time. It says it's a great presentation and it may not directly fall into your research area, but I'd like to know your thoughts on the relative incidence of diseases in wet summer months like those we experienced this year. Since there are fewer choices of seed treatments in organic farming, it might be useful to shed light on this aspect.
That is a good question. We are mostly growing agronomic crops that have fewer problems with disease than horticultural crops, but we definitely did observe that some of our corn hybrids were more sensitive to disease than others. So we had northern corn leaf blight and gray leaf spot come in quite aggressively in some of our corn plots. And it was distinctly, there were distinct differences between hybrids. As I said earlier in the presentation, the importance of stand establishment is so, it's so important. And so in addition to using a good planter, I think there are opportunities to benefit from biological seed treatments. And so that's something that we're working on. We have had some success with a mycorrhizal product that seemed to improve the final yield. This was in 2014, the year that we had such excellent yields, we had a seed treatment experiment where we had a significant yield response to a mycorrhizal product and also to a humate product. And we need to repeat this and make sure that we can get those results multiple years. But the idea of a very low cost investment on the seed to allow you to have a better stand and early, more rapid early growth, I think that's something that would be of interest to any organic farmer. And I think there are some products out there that can probably contribute to that.
Okay, thanks everyone. We're running out of time, and I'd like to thank everyone for submitting questions and encourage you to check out our many other archived and upcoming webinars on organic farming and research topics that are at the link on your screen. And if you have additional general questions about organic farming, also feel free to use the eExtension Ask an Expert service, the link to which is also on your screen. And Joe Gruver, again, is at Western Illinois University. In case you need to contact him directly, you can easily find that on Google. So thank you very much, Joel, for talking with us today, and thanks to everyone for joining us.